Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you for attending Avolution's webinar on digital transformation and how to utilize it to deliver value to your organization. Today, we'll be discussing some effective but also ineffective ways technology transformation can be applied across different industries. We'll explore how it affects our daily lives and discuss some real world scenarios while highlighting on 5 major steps to successful transformation projects. Before we get started, though, it might be worth reintroducing ourselves as Evolution. We provide a tool called Abacus to deliver enterprise architecture and consultancy, but our primary goal and responsibility is to build solutions and provide solutions to solve these types of problems. If you sat in any of our other webinars, you may be familiar with our approaches to road mapping, assessing capabilities, tackling cybersecurity risk, and others. But today we'll be putting a primary focus on digital transformation. So how does transformation affect us? Before we can get into some architectural content in here, it's worth emphasizing some of the more recent scenarios that we faced. This gives us a chance to talk about some of the benefits, but also consequences we face with digital transformation. And in these cases, the technology. From a fintech perspective, we'll be talking about 3 fintech companies that have come into the banking world to disrupt the traditional banking model that's existed. What's enabled this level of disruption was technology that allowed customers to do things like submit loans online, getting notifications on how they spend their money. But they've also removed the ATMs and the physical banks. It's all become mobile or online. And because they originally stemmed from these areas, they've been moving into other areas as well. So now we see fintechs go into things like investing and cryptocurrency and other areas that traditional banks would have considered high risk. We see startup like cultures utilize these new technologies quicker. These recent large shifts, of course, challenge the industry. And it's not actually a bad thing. There's greater innovation in these sectors, and it's good to keep in mind that it becomes more beneficial. With the innovations these companies have come up with, especially during the pandemic, these technologies have now become fundamental for allowing users to manage their money and make their banks accessible from their own homes. However, as I did mention earlier, there are consequences to digital transformation, and consequences affect all types of industry as well. For example, the introduction of food delivery apps brought the convenience of takeout from all types of restaurants that may have originally only allowed sit down customers. However, as food delivery apps continued to grow, more and more restaurants relied on these apps to act as marketing tools and also a primary source of revenue. Restaurants who couldn't keep up with the technology trends closed down due to things like lack of patronage. With the pandemic, it's become even more apparent, with 110,000 US restaurants alone closing and 17% of those restaurants actually permanently closing. Another example are things like delayed and partial payments on goods and services. People can now make payments every month, every 3 months, every 6 months, which is great for people who actually don't have those goods or services and require them. But the consequences of delayed partial payments have left many people in debt. Another one is online news, which of course is nothing new, but it is an important example. From newspapers or physical ways to consume information has transitioned to digital news sites. They share information and have affected traditional newspaper sales. Um, and even minor things like better camera quality on phones have led to things like people becoming DIYers by using better cameras on their phones to take professional quality photos. But as technology increased in phones, this also led to things like built-in GPS systems that where we don't no longer need a separate system to find our way. We can also call different agencies. We can book things online. We can just call an Uber to our location, we no longer need to be anywhere in person. There are just These are just some examples of unintended consequences of digital transformation, and they can all affect multiple industries. This is something that we should definitely keep in mind. There are larger shifts we need to think about when we think about digital transformation, such as the technology itself can drive major changes, which aren't immediately apparent. One area that illustrates this is the automobile industry. The automobile industry introduced one of the biggest shifts in technology in mind. When we think of transformation within the automobile industry, some of the changes we may think of in the last couple decades are small implementations of modern commodities that have made cars smarter. New safety features, new luxury features, which has led to today with self driving cars. The automobile industry has been on the cutting edge of digital transformation. Now, it's not exactly the introduction of self driving cars and all the amenities that's the issue. It's actually the cars themselves because they've just now become big software platforms. Some of the biggest digital transformations across different industries with things like semiconductors, neural networks, and cameras, all of these cutting edge technology transformations aren't coming from camera manufacturers or the semiconductor manufacturers. They're coming from the car manufacturers themselves. But the automobile industry isn't the only industry affected by digital transformation as a huge driving force. Every industry is affected by digital transformation and these changes. Whether it's healthcare or agriculture, technology patents carry across all these industries. Each of these industries tries to harness emerging technologies, which becomes the driving force behind understanding the data and information behind it. An industry like the insurance industry, for example, they've traditionally done predictive models to determine coverage, but now they can actually use real life models. Technology provides them with accurate real time data so they could actually assess how we're driving, which gets passed back to them and they can provide pay as you go coverage. These benefits are an individual consumer are things like individual consumer based payments, but a benefit and consequence is actually bypassing some of those middle steps and the industries in between. Digital transformation and emerging technology have always been an eventuality. But with recent events and huge shifts in the way we handle our day to day as industries, companies, and even individuals, digital transformation has now become a necessity. Another interesting aspect of digital transformation is strategy versus execution. There are various public reports and studies that will kind of balance out and say either strategy is the best or execution is the best, when in reality, it's both. It definitely sounds obvious, but there are instances where we have the best strategy and poor execution, or really no means of executing it, or we can have a really bad strategy and executing it isn't ideal either. The biggest takeaway from this is the significant difference between companies that have a digital transformation strategy, which reported was about 70% of companies actually reporting that they have one in place, but only 10% of those identified some way of executing it. There's also a big shift in levels in the organization as well, with some people like senior executives who are relatively satisfied and comfortable their organizations are prepared. However, in that same study, it's shown that about a third of IT personnel from that same company would actually be concerned if their senior executives knew how unprepared they actually were. So, a part of what we will talk about later on, a small part of the five major steps, is making sure that there's an understanding across the whole organization and that we aren't just building strategies without fully understanding where we are today. So, the takeaway from this is that both a good strategy and a way to execute it are needed, and that we have ways to adapt to these situations. We have to be realistic about reaching a utopia state, but we also have to be realistic about the resources that go into executing these strategies to reach that state. So, from those studies, there are three main points that we can look at why organizations aren't ready for a large scale digital transformation project. We have lack of commitment, lack of resources, and lack of technology. Now, an interesting thing about these is that these weren't discovered through years of study or research into why projects fail. These were actually identified by people interviewed in different companies, and they've all identified these three particular issues. But there's always a flip side to that, though. Identifying how we can become more committed to these environments, part of that is understanding the what we want to do and where we want to go, or just understanding the vision. The resource aspect comes from being more efficient. We may be applying our energy in the wrong direction or maybe even in the wrong area. So, ensuring we have enough resources directed in the correct direction is important. And lastly, the key topic of today's webinar is the lack of technology and using the right tech at the right time. So, we do actually have some examples of using the right tech at the right time. To give some context, we'll be going over some examples of how organizations went in headfirst into applying technology instead of treating digital transformation as solving the problem first and then applying the technology that exists. These companies listed here, I wouldn't say had varying degrees of success, but they've definitely had varying degrees of how they applied transformation. Some of you may remember a company named Juicero. About 4 years ago in 2017, they closed down. But essentially, what they had was what they thought was cutting edge technology. They had an expensive device that could apply 4 tons of pressure to extract juice from these special juice packets that followed a subscription model. The machine itself was $400, which would extract the juice from these special bags. The machine had, at the time, modern technology with things like being able to connect to your Wi Fi or using an app to work. But this is an example of the impact of applying technology first instead of solving an actual problem. At the time, those juice bags that had to be ordered straight from Juicero could easily be extracted with your hands. So now this $400 machine became redundant. So because of that, the machine and the concept was really kind of a flop. But this is actually a really great case study to think back on for applying technology first instead of finding a solution to a problem, then applying the right technology. An even more interesting example with everything moving to a subscription model is a company called Washboard, who effectively allowed people to subscribe to a service for laundry. However, with this service, focusing on a customer base that went to laundromats and needed quarters, Washboard provided a subscription where you could be sent $20 in quarters a month for the cost of $27. Their idea was to charge people who didn't want to go to the bank. For obvious reasons, the company lasted less than a week. This is a good example of applying the wrong solution. We have to think about how to find the solution first, then look for existing technology to apply to meet our solution. So that leads us to what are the 5 steps for transformation? But more specifically, what are the 5 steps for executing these digital transformation strategies? The first is to define a vision. This is something that we've mentioned earlier. The second is to audit your current situation, which means you need a good grounding of where you currently are. The third is to determine your digital maturity, where we can later measure and adjust our way away from the current situation. And lastly, as mentioned earlier, a key step in the success of digital transformation is our communication. We'll touch on each of these topics. So, Defining a vision becomes the first stage and also the fundamental base in our 5 steps. That vision for digital transformation could be understood when we identify some questions that we need to ask and resolve. Some examples could be who's involved in this process. What are we trying to achieve? Are we trying to improve and increase customer satisfaction? Are we trying to reduce costs? Are we making our processes more efficient? If we're looking at digital transformation projects, are we trying to keep up with the market against those new companies coming in and disrupting the market? Or do we address where we might be lacking those technologies others are utilizing? Having a vision in place is an essential and also fundamental first step. You definitely need to get other parts of your organization involved. Once everyone is involved and once everyone has a clear idea what the vision is, it's much easier to move forward and actually start trying to build a successful output. Another key aspect in defining a vision is to actually model the environment. When you have a lot of data across an organization, this is key in understanding that particular vision and how it fits into your organization. A good way to look at it is if you don't know where you are, you don't know where you can go. So that might mean capturing key information, key capabilities or processes. If we're going to go through a transformation project, what systems do we have in place? What do they support? Are there regulations we need to abide by? Knowing all these aspects, which leads into actually with the ability to manage the current situation. So to reiterate, the data we need needs to be centralized. So whether it's through Excel spreadsheets, Visio diagrams, connecting to other service providers, building a model of the current situation is imperative. Having the current situation allows us to build on top of that. The current situation itself varies as well. If you're, as an organization, looking to introduce a transformation project, understanding the current situation means you can make more rational decisions. And what that means is that you can start focusing on the areas that are of concern. The focus is another aspect to take away from this as well. Digital transformation projects range in size, and the amount of time typically indicates how large these projects are. It's important to maintain focus on that initial vision and focus on what the goal should be. One way to do that is to actually plan what the types of metrics and KPIs you want to measure and capture. So, like those fintechs we talked about earlier, where they started their loans and ways to interact with customers, there were certain KPIs that those fintechs were trying to achieve, and that's where the focus was. So, you may be focusing on things like customer growth or reducing costs, or maybe you're just focusing on new markets. But making sure you understand where you are and what the vision is and providing that information is, again, another fundamental step in managing things like transformation. Digital maturity is an interesting step because there are various digital maturity models that you can leverage, and there's various aspects of them that are important. However, once you have your current situation model, you do need to have a degree of self awareness. And I think it was pretty evident in some of those downfalls in companies like Juicero, for example. You need to understand the internal elements with your organization and external elements like who the customer is and do we have any partners we're working with, or maybe what are some preferred channels? Is there an organizational or people aspect to this maturity? When there is significant change in technology, we need to make sure that we can match that digital maturity curve. Some people internally may be susceptible to change, but we've all experienced people who also don't want to go through those technological changes. It's about making sure we can support each step in each process along the way. Capabilities come down to things like our operating model, We want to enhance the effectiveness and efficiency of our organization and how we utilize the technology to drive those processes throughout the model. And lastly, strategies are those digital transformation initiatives. So this is embedding in the actual overall business strategy, but it's also the effect of transforming the overall organization. But if we had to pick one of those today, it would obviously be technology. When we talk about technology and digital maturity that we're trying to score, things like our IT support team and how many channels we're trying to work in, we have to ask ourselves questions. Are there security measures we need to consider if we're developing new technology? And when it comes to systems and applications that we have, if we're removing old systems and introducing new systems, all of these need to be taken into consideration to effectively calculate this digital maturity score. Now, the reason to do this is to understand where we currently are and to also see how flexible we are and how easy it is to change. It also helps drill in on those focus points. Every organization in every industry that's going to go through this process will have different levers that they're pulling across these areas. So you may be working with partners, you may be trying to develop things internally. These factors will level things up and down depending on your focus. Once we finally have all that information, there's always the aspect of maintaining it. That comes down to things like populating the information and embedding enterprise architecture practices across the organization. What we typically find as vendors and with the companies, the customers we work with, it's important that when we're working with on these large transformational projects, that there is awareness across the organization, but that there's also the ability to contribute content as well. And what we find is that when users can contribute information, it gives us the ability to measure and adjust those outcomes. Data owners will need quick access to the data that they own. They need to figure out answers to things like who owns an application, who has access to it, which applications are at a high risk of cybersecurity attacks. These are things that will affect our digital transformation project. Again, understanding our measure and actually being able to adjust those scales is incredibly important. Now, typically the data that we maintain is enough to gain some insight. However, there's no reason to have to maintain that information manually. With all the information we have and the analytics we can run across our systems on whether it's how markets are shifting or how systems are running, is there too much complexity in our organization? Can we rely on these vendors or suppliers? All of these can be passed through algorithms. Now, it's obvious that we should take a smarter approach in the maintenance of our data and also using the data that we have to build to answer the questions to build these insight models. Whether it's building scores, calculating digital maturity for various teams or organizations, also feed into this aspect. Algorithms shouldn't be complex. There are various ways we can leverage and apply algorithms. We can take a deterministic way and use formula-based calculations to gather information. Obviously, this becomes important in calculating things like ROI of different projects, the cost differences between systems. But we can also take a less deterministic approach, like applying machine learning. We can take all of our data and analyze it behind the scenes and start getting information like particular suggestions handed to us. So if you're going through a digital transformation project and you're deciding which technology is best suited for your organization, you may use machine learning algorithms. Is this technology going to give you a quicker time to market? Will it make us more reliable? These are just a handful of aspects that we want to consider when building these type of algorithms. They all feed into the aspects of transformation projects. An important idea to grasp as well during these projects is that they are scenarios. They're just strictly scenarios that we're planning. This is another key aspect in what we do as an organization and what we provide as a solution. So when we plan for these digital transformation projects, we typically don't just have one, we have multiple target states and scenarios to compare against our baseline. The baseline is our current state, and the target states are states that we're trying to approach, or they can be completely distinct scenarios. The idea becomes, how do we transition between these? We may ask ourselves things like, do we decrease the number of systems in one architecture, or are we going to increase them in another? So what we end up doing is building all these what if scenarios to understand the impact. Once we have our vision defined and the current situation modeled and organized, these target states actually help verify that initial vision. If our vision was to identify new markets, maybe introduce new capabilities in order to increase customer satisfaction, reduce complexity, reduce cost, these target scenarios allow us effectively build these trade-off scenarios. So these trade-off scenarios are calculated on those metrics. There's a whole architectural aspect to what's behind the scenes, but what we're actually doing is just comparing them and comparing how they affect our performance on these different scenarios. Remember, this is a technology-driven transformation. When we think digital transformation projects and initiative, we may think of large companies like Google, Amazon, or Facebook. But there's actually an interesting example in a completely different industry. It's actually from a pizza making company that you may be familiar with called Domino's. So Domino's has actually gone through different aspects of digital transformation, and they may have actually started initially with business transformation aspects, such as how do they improve their pizza? Do they work with customer recommendation? They actually realized technology is what they should be focusing on. They tried things like pizza delivery drones, which was just one of the transformations that they made. They also tried to use AI to screen pizzas that were being made and graded based on their AI technology. But then they actually introduced another that's been successful and is actually still being used to this day, which is the pizza tracking on their app. You can now order pizza on a mobile app, track its start to arrival. You don't even need to use the app anymore. You can actually order from other apps like Slack, Facebook Messenger, or you can even do silly things like tweet an emoji and get a pizza. They've effectively paralleled large companies, tech companies like Amazon, going through multiple transformation projects, and it's never ending. They are never ending, and these companies are consistently trying to innovate through these areas, and that they can hopefully drive these situations rather than being driven by the change thrusted upon them. It's an interesting use case, and it's an aspect of all these other aspects of their vision, building upon what they understand is the marketplace today and what they're capable of doing. They realized their digital maturity was really low, so they put a focus and emphasis on improving their current technology. They performed this analysis through different scenarios to actually understand the trade-off. For example, like their drones versus their pizza tracker. What was low cost, what was efficient, what was reliable, and what led to higher customer satisfaction. So now comes the final stage of the 5 steps, which is communication. Has to be the most important step because we can have the best vision, we can understand what we want to do and what we want to accomplish. We know our current situation well. We've performed all these different scenarios and realized which is best moving forward. But it all becomes unnecessary unless everyone in our organization understands internally what's happening. So there are 4 points to this. The first is awareness. You have to understand who the customer is, whether it's internal or external. And you actually need to know what role they play within the organization. Once you do that, now you can start managing those conversations. The second is context. So having a degree of depth and coverage is important in effectively communicating the vision and strategy, but you don't want to lose your audience. Whether it's so high level that internal customers are thinking that this isn't going to work or there isn't enough transparency, to something that's so in depth that it becomes so technical that no one understands what's going on. We need to be able to find that balance so that there's context in how we are going to deliver and communicate these types of transformation projects. Now, third is the story. So, of course, all of this is saying is to just be compelling. This can be through personal experience. You want to tie these transformation projects maybe back to your own experiences. Maybe you want to answer what type of accomplishments we're expecting to achieve at the end of all of this. You need to be able to ground your audience in that journey of understanding where we are and where we want to be. And finally, we have empathy. Understanding your audience is important, but you also have to understand that they have skin in the game as much as you do. You need to make sure what you're saying is credible as well. So, whether you're building partnerships both internally and externally, if you don't have empathy across the challenges that people are facing, whether it's an IT team, marketing team, DevOps team, whether it's the challenges your customers, vendors, or suppliers are facing, you're going to have a difficult time convincing them that this is the right strategy if there's no understanding of their situation. Remember, communication is a huge factor in the success of digital transformation projects, and architectures shouldn't just be a backroom thing anymore. It should be made accessible to everyone. So, how do we make that data accessible? We make sure we can provide all that information live and in real time at the fingertips of anyone who wants to see it at any time. What we mean by that is that we want to tailor those views according to the stakeholder. So, whether people want to understand things like Gantt charts and lifecycle dates, when are the applications going live? When are they reaching their end of support? When are these projects coming into effect? The data needs to be accessible. So maybe it needs to be accessible from a process perspective. We want to start drawing out individual processes or capabilities that we have and understanding that if we introduce new technology, realize that these processes will be affected. There are going to be metric changes, whether it's going to be something like a cost increase or decrease. And the capabilities that we model are going to be useful for connecting a wider organization as well. So dashboards should be full of data. They should give visibility of data and be available to people who should be seeing it, but also allow others to communicate changes so that we can effectively adjust and measure things as well. And we may also have a very technical audience. So don't forget about those guys either. We need to tailor these views according to the user base, whether it's specific knowledge about the systems we have, whether we're focusing on digital transformation projects using new systems. We need to be aware of this and we need to understand how that affects other areas of the organization. The key takeaway from this point is to try to avoid analysis paralysis. We want to make sure that the information is consumable, that there's enough, but yes, there is enough technical depth there if necessary, but we'll provide these high level views, get feedback from those users, and adjust when necessary. The communication aspect of how we deliver these messages becomes really important going forward. So the 5 steps and ensuring that we understand the vision and execute it properly is imperative to successful digital transformation. We don't want to throw new technology at a problem. We want to address it with a relevant solution and then apply the right technology. All of it comes together in a holistic approach in not just understanding our organization, but evolving and transitioning effectively and efficiently.